In student days, one Sunday afternoon, we walked into a central part of Rome and found the place where probably the two great apostles spent their last night on earth. It was the place underground near the Capitol Hill where those to be executed were placed in their last hours. An underground dungeon in the Mamertinum area. Now there would be a place of prayer upon it, but underground you can see how awful it was. And you can imagine the thoughts in the head of anyone spending those last hours on earth therein. At least perhaps normally, but here it wasn't normal, and one can be sure that these two, who possibly suffered martyrdom on the same calendar day by a coincidence, but probably actually not the same year. However, from earliest times they've been feasted on the same day. The difference in the mode of execution would be due to the fact that the Apostle Paul had Roman citizenship because of where he was born, whereas Peter didn't, and therefore two things would differentiate their end. One could be executed within Rome itself, the other, because a Roman citizen could not be put to death within the walls of the city, and therefore he was given the more dignified form of death, rather than crucifixion, of being beheaded in a place of violence. We were talking to the abbot who's there now, Trefontane, Don Jacques, because he was a friend of our community, and he explained how it was a place of violence way before. It was there that gladiators were trained, and therefore training these people who were essentially in the killing business, they had to know how to aim well and how to get at the first shot the head of anyone to be executed. And very often there would be candidates for that treatment at that point in Rome, or just outside. And in those days, long before the invention of the guillotine, the person executing had to be very good at his art. Otherwise it would be lengthy and painful. If he hit first time with a clean break, it was instant. But it demanded, strangely enough, the collaboration of the candidate. I mean the person who was blindfolded and waiting for it to happen. He had to hold out his neck so as precisely to help the other person as he aimed. It was for his own good, actually. So that's the punishment of the great apostle. But it happened that where his head fell, it bounced 3 times. And, as in the case of our St. Winifred of Wales, a well sprang up. There in Wales it's still bubbling forth to this day, producing miracles. Never stopped. In the case of St. Paul, it was 3 bounces and Trefontane, 3 fountains. So it became a holy place. It's actually within walking distance because we walked it to where his head was placed. Also outside the city walls. St. Paul's outside the walls. And under Pope Benedict, excavations were made, carbon dating took place, and they found exactly what they hoped they would. The sarcophagus was there. Sarcophagus means a flesh eater. So in there was the remains of the apostle, which could be dated perfectly, and the inscription corresponded exactly. Paolo, Apostolo et Martyri. So, there's no doubt it was he, and it was under where he should be, under Confessio. With regard to the way in which these two ended up in the Eternal City, we have the fact that actually they did meet in Rome, it would seem, and there is an ancient tradition, and the point is shown, where they last talked on earth to each other. It's on the Via Ostiense. Via Ostiense goes from the centre to the port. Ostia, they mean doors. So they had this encounter in which they knew this is the last time we will talk, and they knew exactly what was ahead. They had got, however, to the centre of civilization. St. Paul had already been to Athens, which was another important centre, and he was able to act in that culture as well. He had good Greek and culture. He was able to quote their poets and used what made sense to them. With regard to St. Paul, we do have a very good account from his own disciple Luke, who copied down what he heard from St. Paul. Therefore, we have very good facts coming through St. Luke. He would have been close to the apostolic band, but not an apostle himself, and his gospel and the Acts are good historical documents. He has an eye for detail. But it stops when St. Paul is in Rome under house arrest for 2 years and able to diffuse the gospel in that 2-year period on a personal level. Now, one time when a student, because I was doing classics, I was able, on university money, to spend a whole month in Rome and Greece looking at things which would have been of interest for the classical period, but also the Christian period. And when in Greece at one point, I happened to go into one of the local churches in a village in Greece, therefore to be Greek Orthodox, and I was able to see in this church, which was really dedicated to St. Paul, a brief history of him, and the Greek was easy enough to pick up, and it was more or less saying that the tradition was that actually St. Paul did, after, and this is what I was interested in, after that period in Rome, of which the Act speaks, actually have a second chance. And he was able to go, it says it went as far as Spain with Paul. Now, I don't know if that's all tradition, but I thought that's interesting. Whatever the case may be, we don't have details in the Acts as to how St. Peter got to Rome. What we do know is that the first agglomeration was Antioch, and that there he would have been, obviously, as the head of the band, the bishop. So his first see is at Antioch, and there's still memory of that liturgically. And it was only in the second time that he became now Bishop of Rome. Obviously, it was not as settled as Antioch, because obviously there was a concentration of Christians. They were being called already Christians there. And we know from early testimony that in Antioch, things took form very quickly. The evidence is given by St. Ignatius. Ignatius was an early bishop of Antioch, and he gives a whole ecclesiology. In his letters and in his writings, he insists already at the apostolic nature of the church in its developed form of bishop, priest, and deacon, episkopos, overseer, presbyteros, which is the word priest, elder, and diakonos has always had that sense of servant. So it's already clearly there, and they are distinguished as orders. And by the way, in the early church, one could remain a deacon, and sometimes a good deacon was made a bishop or even pope. It's called per saltum, by a jump. It can happen because the episcopacy contains the other as well. So, the structure in Rome is not quite as clear in the early documents that we have. It takes a while to evolve in the form that we know, for this reason, that it's more diluted. It's not quite so simple to have a central person in the midst of heavy persecution. And each pope, for centuries, is going to be under risk of martyrdom. Practically everyone actually is martyred. So that's the situation. But there are hints that it was coming into form, and also that it's being transmitted to another important see fairly early on. You may remember that another important disciple of Peter was Mark. Now, it's important to know that these are therefore as close as one can possibly get to the Lord. Therefore, Mark too is transmitting very good tradition. It's possible that he's mentioned in the Acts themselves. He certainly is the first one to take the gospel in its full force to the north of Egypt and becomes the first bishop of Alexandria. And his body was there after his martyrdom, and it was under the threat from the Islamic bloc that they decided that they had to rescue that before it was desecrated. And they did, using this ploy. They put it in a chest and gave to understand that the customs that it was full of impure flesh, swine and the like, therefore it wouldn't be opened or touched. And they got through, and it was put therefore on the waterways and got to a natural resting place on the waterways in Europe, Venice. And there it was put under the present high altar in the most eastern looking church that we have as a cathedral in the west. St. Mark's in Venice is very much like a Byzantine church. Mosaics, domes and all. The influence of the East is there, a bridge. And he's there, and has never been touched. We were asked one time to sing in Gregorian chant, close to it, a very moving experience. So Mark was there, transmitting what he got from Rome. And there is always, in the early period, a close link between Rome and Alexandria. And then Alexandria takes on its own life. Very important historically. Why? Great giants spring up there. Theologians who defend the Trinity and Christology correctly, and the likes of St. Athanasius, who stood against the world, Athanasius contra mundum, and also wrote the life of St. Anthony, and that went round the whole Mediterranean basin like wildfire, and huge numbers of people went into the monastic world, including the great Augustine. You might know that it was all because of what he overheard one day. It was two soldiers who decided to follow this great band of conquerors into the desert. And he and his friends said in the garden, "Look how these simple people conquer heaven while we waste time with our philosophy." And they decided themselves to embrace the monastic life. However, in a very intellectual way and in a very presbyteral way, forming priests and bishops who would then be bishops of the area, because there was a bishop in every town. All completely wiped out eventually in the 6th and 700s by Islam. So this is our origin. When it got to Rome, of course, it was going to then change language. For the first time, they'd have to adapt to Latin, which was to be the whole of our area in the West. The Celtic monks were using Latin, we forget that, in the liturgical prayer. And we have, in common with all the rites of the West, what we're using today, the old canon. It's definitely apostolic in origin. One can see that from the language and the expressions and the Judaic mode, and it's very ancient. It's what is always in common to all the rites, including Sarum in England, which gave rise to the present Book of Common Prayer in the Anglican Church, but it's all completely expunged from anything sacrificial. I conclude. These saints were nothing on their own. Simon Peter just went back fishing when they were disappointed after the crucifixion. Paul did everything he could to destroy the Christian Christian movement, they were nothing on their own, but one man with God is a majority.